Hi everybody, this is Leo Volont with part 2 of my 3-part series, The Virgin Mary and a Love Story. In the first part, we discussed the beginnings of the Carmelite order in the Catholic Church, but in this part, we discuss how the Carmelite order began for the Jews. Now, it's a fact of history that the Messianic mission of Jesus almost exactly some 2,000 years ago had failed. Of course, we can impute this failure to widespread moral decadence, but isn't that always very much the case? If we should wish to be charitable, then we might notice that perhaps the historical timing had all been wrong. Jesus, if he had lived to face them, would have been confronted by strong empires on every point of the compass. But looking back to less than 1,000 years before Jesus, then we notice a period when history all about were in decline and no new empires had yet risen to take up their place. And this is when perhaps a serious Messianic mission might have been mounted. This was the time of King David, and yes, we can see when we look at the history that without any competing empires to intimidate them, that first King David and then afterwards King Solomon seemed to flourish, and this despite themselves. David would dance drunk and naked in the streets, killing men to steal their wives. Do you think that people might have been somewhat leery of that? Solomon, next in line after David, was also a playboy, and he bankrupted his kingdom to build a temple for a religion that the people knew wasn't his only interest. It was as though it were Solomon's plan to make his people either resentful of a religion that would bleed them dry, building a temple that could only appeal either to God's vanity or his own, or make them resentful of himself for being too morally unfit to even go near such a temple. This Davidic dynasty, soft with decadence and corruption, did not continue long past Solomon, as first the tax revolt disintegrated into civil war, and then the nation was finally dismembered by the rising Assyrian and Babylonian empires. It had been like a wasted life. The brief window of Messianic opportunity had already closed. But why had there not been a Messiah when a Messiah might have been successful? Well, good question. I suppose it was a matter of being ill-prepared. There had not been any preparation in righteousness, piety, or purity. For instance, the prophet back then, just before David, was a lecher named Samuel. What Samuel had done was that he had demanded Saul be appointed as king. But this was when Saul had been a good-looking boy. But then 20 years later found a new pretty boy in David, whom he now pressed to be king. But it could only happen through a civil war. Saul wasn't going anywhere just because an old pervert got tired of him, right? So yes, if the prophet Samuel was any kind of a fair representation, then it seems that a disgusting moral decadence was a characteristic of the time. And that seems to have been the opinion of Elijah, a prophet who came about a century after Solomon, who seemed to have been aware of the lost Messianic opportunity, and who made it his mission to see that if there should ever be a next time, that the proper preparations in righteousness should be taken. Even the Bible gives us some hint of Elijah's mission. We are told of a drought, and that day after day for 7 days Elijah had asked a servant to climb Mount Carmel and look for any cloud. None was seen until when, on the 7th day, there was a small cloud. Elijah had taken that to mean that there would pass 7 dynasties or ages until the next opportunity. So Elijah went to work to put together an organization, a brotherhood that could stand up to 7 ages of work, which would turn out to be the better part of about 1,000 years, building a social and religious purity from which it could be possible to raise up a plausible Messiah. Well, most importantly, the family of the Messiah would have to be especially monitored and protected. It seems that Elijah and then his successors were able to resort to magic. They had the rod of Aaron from the Ark of the Covenant. The rod was kept in his old cave at Mount Carmel. By the way, for those of you who dream, well, that cave is the same cave as the dark cave of prayer. You know, the one you might encounter in your dreams. And the old man you find there, you know, the guy that always gives you some kind of good advice, well, that's Elijah. Okay, back to the rod. The rod's magic was such that every time a new female baby was born in the line of the Messiah, it would temporarily come to life, blooming forth in leaf and flower. The monks of the order would then scurry forth and find among the new babies in the land one with a special birthmark. One big hint was that they expected the Messiah to come from out of the house of David. And then, of course, after the first generation, the monks knew exactly where to look for the new babies. The baby of a previous baby. Kept with Aaron's rod was what appeared like a small artificial tree, to which branches and segments were added to record the births and genealogy that would lead to the Messiah. And yes, it was always girls. The rod would not bloom for boys. Maybe this was at first surprising, as the Hebrews were a patriarchal society. But this was not a matter of inheriting power or passing down property. Besides, mothers have babies and fathers only have maybes. Anne, who would be Mary's mother, appeared by all signs as being near the prophesied seventh age, and the formation of the branches and segments of the record tree were approaching their culmination point. So when she reached maturity, got married, and became pregnant, the Brotherhood seemed to hold its breath and wait for the seventh sign and the birth of the seventh and final generation of purity. But it didn't happen. Anne had a baby, and it was a daughter, but the rod stayed lifeless. Of course, Anne loved her baby, but still, she knew it was not all that special. And then afterwards, Anne remained barren for the next 19 years. It must have seemed very puzzling. But the angels intervened. Now this is where our history becomes a bit even more peculiar. No materialist will like what comes next. I refer to the published notebooks kept on the accounts given by the Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, 1774 to 1824, Catholicism's foremost seer and visionary, who looked back on biblical times and saw what had really happened and wasn't afraid to tell about it in extensive detail. I decided to trust her insofar as her views were almost always at variance to the traditions she could have been expected to uphold had she simply been a mouthpiece for church propaganda. Anyway, the way she tells it, there had been the holy thing from the old Ark of the Covenant, now lost, but before it had been lost by being too well hid, the holy thing, along with Aaron's rod, had been removed for safekeeping. The wisdom of that decision being obviously well vindicated. This holy thing is reported to source all the way back to Adam, and then having been passed to Abraham by an angel, then passed down from father to son, until it finally rested with Joseph in Egypt. But then, however much longer afterwards, we have Moses raiding Joseph's crypt and taking possession of it, and then bringing it along on his 40 years exodus, placing it among the other objects in the ark. This holy thing was said to be the spiritual core of purity from Adam himself, snatched out of him by an angel just a moment before his first sin and subsequent fall from the heights of spirituality to the depths of just being but a mere man. Just think about it. One moment he had been on a par with the angels, and the next not much more than a monkey. I suppose we can all commiserate at least a little bit with that, huh? An angel, coming to address the problem with Anne, asked that the holy thing be passed into her by her husband, who just so happened to be a priest in the temple and could therefore be expected to understand the situation. Yeah, one wonders about the details regarding how such holy things can be passed back and forth into people, but as it worked out, the holy thing from Adam became Mary inside of Anne. Whatever the biological details were, as far as the holy thing was involved, Mary comes to us as effectively the pure daughter of the still spiritual Adam from paradise. The girl child Eve would have had they not fallen from grace. Yeah, we can see how Anne Catherine Emmerich fills in a lot that the Bible leaves out, can't we? So of course, 9 months later, on the occasion of Mary's advent, Aaron's rod in the cave of Elijah burst forth in its greatest floral profusions yet. And in the next, third and final part of our series, we will finally get to those episodes in Mary's earthly career that we've been so curious about. Thanks everybody, see you soon.